What you're about to see is a combination of several factors that by themselves would be very tricky for pilots to deal with, but combined forms the stuff of nightmares. Stay tuned. Back in the 1970s, Pacific Western Airlines, or PWA, ran an extensive short-haul network connecting cities across the vast interior of Western and Northern Canada. Although the airline was owned by the provincial government of Alberta, it also served many cities in neighbouring British Columbia, including the city of Cranbrook, located in the Rocky Mountains near the US border. In the afternoon of the 11th of February 1978, a PWA flight crew therefore was preparing to fly a regularly scheduled service from Calgary, Alberta, over to Cranbrook. The aircraft they were about to operate was a Boeing 737-200, one of the earliest versions of the 737 family, and one that is actually still used by several regional airlines in Canada to serve remote Arctic destinations. It's uniquely fit to do so because of its sturdy frame, reliable engines, and its ability to fit gravel kits, making it possible to fly to dirt runways. But Cranbrook wasn't at all that type of destination. It wasn't a large city, but it did have a proper runway measuring 6,000 feet, equipped with an instrument landing system, full approach lighting, and most of the amenities that one would expect from a modern commercial airport. But the one thing that it didn't have was an actual control tower, and we'll get to the significance of that in just a moment. Now, the pilots of this flight would have been extremely familiar with flights to untowered airports, because PWA served those types of airfields virtually every day, and normally without any type of issues. The pilot in command on this flight was 30 years old and had almost 5,200 hours of total flying time, of which more than half had been operated on the 737, so he was quite familiar with the type. His first officer on this day was 25 years old and quite new, with about 1,300 hours of total time, including only 81 on the 737, which he had just started flying for PWA. As they sat down for their quick pre-flight briefing, they would have noted that the aircraft was in good working order, with nothing in the technical log that would affect their flight. But the weather at their destination wasn't ideal. There had been heavy snowfall in Cranbrook during the morning, with almost a meter of snow on the ground and some continuing light snowfall at the time, which restricted visibility down to 3/4 of a mile, or about 1,200 meters. But since Cranbrook had an instrument landing system, these conditions weren't really a big problem, and this kind of weather was also common in the Rocky Mountains during the winter, so there was no question that they would go ahead with the flight. While the pilots completed the pre-flight setup, 3 cabin crew members helped board the flight's 44 passengers for a total of 49 people on board. Keeping the turnaround relatively quick, PWA Flight 314 soon started taxiing out to the runway in Calgary, where after receiving their takeoff clearance, the 2 pilots powered up the 737-200's 2 cigar-shaped JT8 Delta engines and then started accelerating down the runway, becoming airborne at 12:32 local time. And it was at that moment, over in the Calgary control tower, that the first link in a disastrous chain of events began to take shape. You see, it was standard practice for controllers to provide an estimated time of arrival, or ETA, to the controllers at each aircraft's destination in order to give them a heads up when the aircraft would likely come in. And according to the Canadian ATC manual at the time, this ETA was defined as the estimated time of arrival over the approach aid to be used. And there was no real information about how that ETA should be calculated. In the case of Cranbrook, aircraft arriving from Calgary normally performed an ILS approach to runway 16 from the north, so controllers would estimate the time of arrival over the initial approach fix for that approach, which was a non-directional radio beacon in the nearby town of Shukamashuk. Pilots and controllers normally call this the Shukum beacon, although it was officially known by its 2-letter designation, Sierra X-ray. Now, because the manual didn't provide any clear instructions for formulating an ETA, each controller had a slightly different technique for taking into account factors like weather and the procedures that they expected the aircraft to use, and the result of that was that ETAs were often considerably different from what the actual arrival time would be. As a matter of fact, PWA flights from Calgary to Cranbrook almost always took about 25 minutes, with very little variance, only a couple of minutes in either direction. PWA personnel, well, they were well aware of this, and ground staff in Calgary actually passed an ETA for Flight 314 to their counterparts in Cranbrook that was extremely accurate, to within 1 minute. But that ETA was only used for passenger handling purposes, and it wasn't normally communicated to anyone outside of the company itself. So, without specific knowledge of PWA's operations, the ETA calculated by Calgary Air Traffic Control made incorrect assumptions about how Flight 314 would fly its approach into Cranbrook. And that meant that while the internal PWA prediction was that Flight 314 would arrive at 12:55, Calgary ATC predicted that it would arrive 10 minutes later, at 13:05, and this was the figure that they transmitted over to Cranbrook. Now you may recall that Cranbrook was an uncontrolled airport without a real tower, so who was receiving this message then? Well, actually, what Cranbrook had instead of a control tower was something called an air radio station. This concept exists in most countries, and each country calls it something different, but basically this position serves to provide advisory information about conditions at the airport without the authority to give real instructions to aircraft like an air traffic controller can. And since communication in general is so important, I am super happy to present today's sponsor, Saily, an eSIM app that will keep you connected wherever you go. Saily is created by the tech geniuses over at the Nord Group, who are a fantastic group of supporters for our content. And with Saily, you will never need another physical SIM card again to avoid those ridiculous roaming fees when you're traveling. Saily offers affordable data plans in over 150 countries, and it's super easy to use. You just download the app, choose your plan, install your SIM and then activate. Voila! And you're done within minutes. And I myself normally activate it while I'm waiting for the plane to push back before I go out on my trip. That way it's always working when I land. Now Saily works perfectly with both iOS and Android, and they always offer 24/7 support if you should need it, which I actually never have because it works like a charm. So if you want to make sure that you have easy mobile internet access the next time you travel, go to saily.com/pilot and use my code PILOT for a great 15% discount on your first purchase. That's saily.com/pilot with the code PILOT. Thank you, Saily. Now let's continue with those air radio operators I mentioned before. At Cranbrook, the air radio operator was responsible for keeping flight crews updated with the latest weather, informing them of any other factors that might affect their approach or landing, and also controlling the movement of ground vehicles on the runway. At the time that Flight 314 took off, the Cranbrook air radio operator was monitoring the progress of a snowplow that was clearing snow away from the runway in between the scheduled arrivals. When snow was falling continuously, like it was on this day, the air radio operator's manual recommended that snowplows should be called back only about 5 minutes before an aircraft's expected arrival time. This would minimize the amount of snow that could accumulate between the departure of the snowplow and the arrival of the aircraft, and therefore provide the best possible landing conditions for the aircraft. But at this point, it's important to stop and note that the air radio operator's manual wasn't based on any official regulations at the time. And in fact, the position of an air radio operator was basically not even mentioned in Canada's aviation rules at all. One of the side effects of this lack of formalization was that the practices for controlling ground vehicles were incompatible with air traffic controllers' entirely separate practices for formulating ETAs. So, unaware of this fact, the Cranbrook air radio operator believed that PWA Flight 314 would arrive at 13:05 as he had been advised. So, unless the flight crew informed him otherwise, he would order the snowplow off the runway at 1300. Now, the air radio operator had been working at that position for 5 years, so he had probably observed long ago that Calgary's ETAs were not always trustworthy. But again, keep in mind that unless the pilots themselves provided a different time, Calgary's ETA was all that he really had to work with. This was a problem because Calgary's ETAs were never intended to be used for separating aircraft and ground vehicles, and the controllers who formulated them probably had no idea they were being used for that purpose. All this just goes to show how a lot of standard practices back in 1978 hadn't been formalized and regulated to the extent that they are today. And these gaps were about to have serious consequences for PWA Flight 314. Now, speaking of safety gaps, before we go any further, I want to also talk about the design and operation of the 737-200's thrust reversers, because those are also going to play a big role in this story. Thrust reversers help slow the airplane down after a landing or a rejected takeoff by basically redirecting the direction of the thrust into a slightly forward angle. And while they are very loud and noticeable to passengers, they're actually just a braking assistance mechanism. Most of the real deceleration still comes from the regular wheel brakes. But thrust reversers can make a major difference when the runway is slippery or wet, and they also help reduce the brake energy that goes into the brake discs, which lowers the overall brake temperatures and therefore facilitates quicker turnaround. So almost every transport category jet now has them. The Boeing 737-200 has what's known as bucket-style reversers, which reverse the thrust direction by folding down over the back of the engine to physically deflect the exhaust forward as it leaves the engine. For the pilots to deploy the thrust reversers, the thrust levers must first be in the idle position to avoid generating any forward thrust, and the pilot can then move the reverser levers, which are attached to the thrust levers, in order to command the hydraulic reverser actuators to open the bucket doors. And then moving the reverser levers beyond the first detent will cause the engine to spool up, which will then increase the amount of reverse thrust as long as the buckets are correctly in position. Once the plane has slowed down, moving the reverser levers back to their resting position then reduces power again and finally commands the hydraulic directional control valve to stow the bucket doors. Now, because reverse thrust on the 737-200 was only intended for use on the ground and could be catastrophic if activated in the air, this system featured several different lockout mechanisms to prevent unintended use in the air of the reversers. One lockout mechanism prevented the pilot from moving the reverser levers unless the thrust levers were in the idle position, and it also prevented the pilot from increasing reverse thrust until the reverser doors had fully deployed. At the same time, another lockout mechanism prevented the pilot from applying forward thrust using the regular thrust levers when the reverser doors were open, or at least that was the idea. You see, the design of this lockout system had some serious flaws. The issue was that the lockout was governed by a rotating cam instead of a solenoid or some other type of electrical connection. With a solenoid, you can have a binary choice, where if the doors are closed, the thrust levers can be moved, and if the doors are not closed, they can't. But a purely mechanical cam allows for an infinite range of in-between positions, where the doors are neither open nor closed, and forward thrust is neither fully blocked nor fully allowed. In fact, as the bucket doors approach the stowed position, they would start turning the cam to release the lockout, allowing forward thrust to be applied proportionally to the amount that the cam had rotated. This meant that it was technically possible to start applying forward thrust when the doors were almost closed, rather than fully closed. But this wouldn't actually have been a major issue, if not for the influence of yet another safety system. You see, in order to prevent the reverser doors from leaving the closed position when the plane was in the air, an air-ground interlock would activate to cut hydraulic power to the door actuating system. And this would happen as soon as the weight on wheel switches on the main landing gear sensed that the aircraft was airborne. This meant that even if the pilot tried to deploy the reversers in flight, they wouldn't be able to do so. But it also meant that if the plane lifted off the ground while the reversers were still open for some reason, there would be no hydraulic power left to close them. At some point during the 1970s, this discrepancy was pointed out to Boeing. So in 1977, Boeing added a caution to the flight crew operations manual, warning that attempting to go around after deploying the reversers could cause one or more of the reversers to get stuck open. Now, Going around after deploying the reversers has been prohibited basically everywhere ever since thrust reversers became a thing, not only because of problems like this, but also because of the high risk of overrunning the runway while trying to regain takeoff speed. You see, even with a well-functioning design, it always takes a while for the reverser system to go from deployed back to idle, stowed and locked, and then for the engines to spool back up again to give enough thrust. And that poses a very real and serious threat that pilots have a hard time accounting for. Anyway, this still happens occasionally, even today, but as it turns out, PWA pilots were widely aware that some of their colleagues had successfully done these type of maneuvers on multiple different occasions. Now, for me personally, it was drilled into me very thoroughly that once I've started moving the reversal levers, there's absolutely no possibility of a go-around anymore. But that kind of strict training isn't universally applied or equally effective in all cases, and it certainly wasn't as strict back in 1978. Now, on the 737-200, if one reverser did get stuck open in flight, the airplane would still be controllable in theory, and there was also a way to get it closed again. On the rear overhead panel, behind and above the pilots, there were two thrust reverser override switches, each protected by a guard and a witness wire. And those switches would restore hydraulic power to the reversers in flight so that the pilot could stow it. This meant that if a reverser came open in flight, there would be a warning light on the dash, and the emergency procedure associated with that light called for using those thrust reverser override switches. Now, I know that this is a lot of technical information, but try to hang on to it for a little while because we will be needing it pretty soon again. Anyway, returning to the story. By this point, Flight 314 was climbing away from Calgary and approaching its cruising altitude of flight level 200 or 20,000 feet. But the flight was so short that at 12:42, just 4 minutes into the cruise, the first officer sent in a request to the Calgary controller to start the descent. The controller came back and cleared Flight 314 to approach Cranbrook, but he also told them to descend and gave them the local altimeter setting. 2 minutes later, as the flight was descending through 18,000 feet, the first officer signed off with the Calgary controller and instead contacted Cranbrook Air Radio to report that they were clear for the approach and to request the latest weather. The air radio operator reported that the wind was out of 150 degrees at 6 knots and that there was no traffic known in the area. This was then read back by the first officer, but the air radio operator then added, and 314, the sweeper on the runway has been for some time trying to keep snow back for you. I'll let you know what it's like as soon as I get a progress from him. And the visibility, well, not much change in the weather, maybe visibility about 3/4 of a mile in snow. And in response to that, the first officer simply said, 314 checks. Now, I want to stop here and add some context to what was going on at that very moment. Because it turns out that the captain who was pilot flying wasn't listening to the Cranbrook Air radio. Instead, his radio was tuned to a company frequency and he was busy chatting with another PWA pilot about the stock market and some other casual things. Now, back in 1978, the sterile cockpit rule didn't exist yet. That's the rule that prohibits pilots from having off-topic conversations below 10,000 feet and during other critical phases of flight. And it is also worth mentioning that even if the sterile cockpit rule had existed, this flight was still a little bit more than 10,000 feet above the field elevation, so it technically wouldn't have applied here. But what now happened serves as a great example of why it's a good idea to keep the cockpit sterile, at least during the descent in basically all cases. You see, this was a very short flight without much en route time for chit-chat, and the fact that the captain felt comfortable having an idle conversation during the descent, well, it basically tells me that he was likely very familiar with this route and maybe more than a little bit complacent about it. Anyway, the consequences of that was that he didn't hear the Cranbrook Air Radio operator talking about a snowplow on the runway. And this fact caused quite a bit of controversy after the accident because the flight crew's distraction at this critical moment wasn't listed in the final report as a contributing factor in the accident. And that was even though several members of the investigation team later told an independent review that, in their opinion, this factor was actually important. And I couldn't agree more. The final report and the independent review of Canada's investigation agency both characterized the pilot's decision to engage in off-topic conversations as unprofessional and poorly disciplined. And in fact, one of the investigators told the review board that they would have cited this as a contributing factor if it hadn't been for the pressure that they received from the airline, PWA. But with the benefit of almost 50 years of hindsight, I would say that the real causes of this distraction would be more appropriately described as the absence of a sterile cockpit philosophy and probably an overly casual culture at PWA at the time. That's rather than some kind of personal failings with these particular pilots. Anyway, returning to the moment of the radio call, we also need to address the question of why the first officer didn't speak up about the snowplow once the captain came back on the frequency. Unfortunately, the cockpit voice recording from this flight was lost, so we don't know exactly what was said in the cockpit, but it's pretty self-evident that the first officer either didn't hear about the snowplow, or if he did, he failed to highlight it to the captain. The reason for this isn't really discussed in the report, but from my point of view, it could be because the wording used by the air radio operator actually had two possible interpretations. One of those was that a snow sweeper was currently plowing the runway and that it would be called back inside once the driver reported that he was done. And that was obviously what the air radio operator actually meant. But another interpretation was that the snowplow had previously been out on the runway at some undetermined time and that the air radio operator was going to ask the driver how much he had done. In a cockpit environment with multiple distractions, it's possible that the first officer heard something like the second interpretation and didn't process that the snow sweeper was at that moment still on the runway, which actually would kind of make sense since they had already received approach clearance. And he obviously had no way of knowing that the standard practice of Cranbrook was to call off the snow sweeper 5 minutes before their expected arrival, and that the only ETA that the air radio operator had so far was 10 minutes wrong. So now, since Cranbrook Airport didn't have radar, the only assurance that the snowplow would exit the runway before Flight 314 landed was the assumption that the pilots would report their position during the approach. And indeed, it was customary for pilots approaching Cranbrook to inform the air radio operator when they crossed the Shukam beacon and entered final approach. Guidance for pilots at the time recommended making a report on final approach to uncontrolled airports, but this guidance lacked regulatory force, so while pilots almost universally agreed that proper airmanship demanded a report, it was not technically required, legally speaking. Anyway, all that we know is that the crew of Flight 314 didn't make such a report when they started their approach. Maybe because they were distracted with something else. Who knows? So in fact, the first officer's acknowledgement of the information about the snowplow was the last transmission made from Flight 314 prior to their arrival. So what now actually happened was that the air radio operator expected Flight 314 to report over the Shukam beacon and probably also to request an update on the visibility and status of the snowplow. And when he didn't hear those calls, he assumed that this meant that the flight wasn't on final approach yet. If the pilots had made the routine report that everyone else normally made, the air radio operator would have realized that Flight 314 was only about 5 minutes away from the airport, and he would then have told the snowplow to vacate the runway. But that tragically didn't happen. As Flight 314 approached Cranbrook Airport, following the guidance from the instrument landing system, they had no way of seeing the snowplow through the falling snow. With only 3/4 of a mile of visibility, the approach lights and the runway lights would have become visible well before the actual runway surface did. And to make matters even worse, the snowplow was facing away from the airplane, with a plume of snow flying off its brush, which only further obscured it against the white background. This also meant that the snowplow driver couldn't see the airplane coming since it was approaching from behind him, and the air radio operator wasn't a controller and didn't have a control tower, so he was unable to see either the snowplow or the airplane. This all meant that by this point, Flight 314 was on course for a disaster, but one last twist still remained in store. At time 12:55, PWA Flight 314 touched down on runway 16 about 800 feet down the runway, and the captain immediately applied reverse thrust to begin slowing the airplane down. But almost at the exact same moment that he started moving the reverse levers, he suddenly saw the snowplow on the runway in front of them. Which, if that would have happened to me, would have probably scared the living daylight out of me. Now, it would have been immediately obvious that they would hit the snowplow if he didn't take action straight away. So, acting lightly on almost pure instinct, the captain now called for a go-around, stowed the reverses and then started pushing the thrust levers forward to go-around or toga thrust. It is possible that as he started pushing the thrust levers, the equally startled first officer might have also tried to do the same thing, and medical examinations later suggested that the captain may have fractured his thumb when the first officer pinned his hand against the thrust levers. But if that did happen, it wasn't the biggest problem that the captain now faced. Because in the rush of aborting the landing so quickly, he had missed that the left thrust reverser doors hadn't fully closed when he started pushing the thrust levers forward, which again, he was able to do since the lockout cam had already partially released. At the same time, he started rotating to raise the nose, causing the main landing gear to lift off the runway, which de-energized the weight on wheel switches. This now cut off hydraulic power to the reverser doors, while they were still at least 4 to 5 centimeters short of being fully closed. So as the plane now accelerated back into the air, the force of the airflow into that 5 centimeter gap started to push the bucket doors back open again. And the hydraulic actuators couldn't resist this force because they had been de-energized. As a result, within seconds, the left thrust reverser now fully deployed in flight. And as that happened, a safety system noticed this deployment and snapped the left thrust lever back into idle in order to prevent the development of full reverse thrust. But the open bucket doors and the asymmetric loss of thrust now left the plane with a severe imbalance of thrust and drag. Still climbing into the air, but losing speed, the 737 cleared the top of the snowplow by about 50 feet, prompting the driver to exclaim, "Where the hell did he come from?" Back on board the plane, it must have been absolute chaos in the cockpit as the flight crew now tried to handle the sudden loss of thrust during a go-around while dealing with massive stress from the surprise of seeing the snowplow, confusion from the deployment of the reverser, and possible pain from the captain's fractured thumb. Both pilots now applied right rudder and right aileron to compensate for the plane's strong desire to yaw and roll to the left, but they were now flying at the very limits of what was theoretically possible. And that was because, amid the confusion, they hadn't remembered to retract the flaps and landing gear, which now increased their drag even further. So on top of the loss of thrust and drag from the buckets, they were now losing airspeed fast, and since the authority of the flight controls is proportional to the airspeed, they would soon be unable to stop the left yaw if this continued. Unfortunately, in such an extreme situation, with so much stress and so little time to react, it would have taken almost superhuman instincts to avoid the loss of control. And it was at this point, at the worst possible moment, that one of the pilots momentarily stopped applying right rudder. Now, investigators later noted that the guard over the left thrust reverser override switch was found open and that the witness wire was broken while the right switch was untouched. So they speculated that one of the pilots might have seen the thrust reverser warning light and attempted to follow the emergency procedure that I described earlier. And in the process of trying to reach up and flip that override switch, the first officer might have accidentally lifted his foot off the rudder pedal or even touched the left. But remembering this obscure switch in a matter of seconds in such a high-stress environment is pretty hard to imagine for me as a pilot. Also, while the guard had been opened, the switch was never actually moved, so it is unclear if anyone actually got that far. Due to the loss of the cockpit voice recorder, we will never know if the pilots somehow remembered the override switch, but in any case, they didn't manage to store the reverser before ultimately completely losing control of the plane. The momentarily loss of the right rudder input caused the plane to yaw and then roll sharply to the left, at which point recovery became impossible due to low speed. Over the air radio frequency, one of the pilots was now heard shouting, "We're gonna crash!" The first officer evidently soon stomped on the right rudder pedal again, and someone also started retracting the flaps towards 15 degrees, but at that point, it was already too late. The plane banked over 90 degrees to the left and slammed into the ground beyond the end of runway 16, less than 20 seconds after the start of the go-around. On impact, the front of the plane broke apart and the center wing section was consumed by an explosion as the fuel tanks ignited. Almost everyone on board was killed during the crash and the following fire, but the tail section came to rest mostly intact, and a flight attendant and a passenger were able to escape through one of the rear exit doors. 3 other passengers also escaped from the tail section through a break in the fuselage, and one passenger was thrown out from the plane during the crash and survived after landing in the deep snow, still strapped in his seat. Responding fire trucks couldn't reach the scene due to the deep snow, so firefighters and witnesses waded out to the wreckage on foot, where they managed to find the survivor inside of the forward cabin. But that passenger unfortunately passed away in a hospital a few days later. In total, only 6 people survived this accident, while 43 others lost their lives. Although the investigation into this crash was hampered by the severe fire damage to both the flight recorders, investigators were able to determine that the contributing factors included an incorrect ETA from Calgary ATC, the pilot's failure to report crossing the Skogum beacon, the deployment of the left thrust reverser in flight, inadequate regulations governing communications at uncontrolled airports, and the inability of the Boeing 737 to safely perform a go-around after reverser deployment on touchdown. Today, the procedures used by pilots, controllers and advisory services at uncontrolled airports are much more formalized in order to prevent the kind of miscommunication that led up to this tragedy. The investigators also noted that for an airline like PWA, which was operating large jets into small uncontrolled airports during bad weather, the ability to go around after reverser deployment was desirable, but no aircraft at the time was required to have this capability. So as a direct result of this accident, Canada became one of the only countries to require manufacturers to demonstrate in certification testing that their aircraft could safely go around after a reverser deployment. And this type of a go-around has since become known around the world as the Cranbrook maneuver, in honor of PWA Flight 314. Today, more robust lockout systems help ensure that the reversers stay stowed when the plane is still in the air, and better training has helped make pilots less likely to attempt the Cranbrook maneuver in the first place. And that's especially important because even modern-day thrust reversing systems are not always 100% perfect, as the pilots of this TAP Air Portugal flight found out the hard way. Now, thank you so much for watching, and if you want to see my next video before anyone else, then please go to patreon.com/join/mentorpilot and sign up. My name is Petter Hörnfeldt, you are watching Mentor Pilot, and I hope you will have an absolutely fantastic day. Bye-bye.